From an ER nurse's point of view, this story hits hard because every second feels earned. Lena notices blood type tattoos, wound angles, breathing patterns, exit routes, and human fear before anyone else does. But this is more than medical drama, it is precision under pressure. When armed men enter the hospital and panic starts to spread, the nurse holding the line is the one nobody thought to fear. "Get her out of my operating room," the surgeon's voice was like ice. He did not even look up from the patient's chest, which was open on the table. He spoke as if Lena Brooks, who stood just 3 feet from him holding the next instrument, was not even there. He treated her like an object, a ghost in the room. The patient on the table had maybe 6 minutes left before his heart gave out, and the surgeon in charge just sent her away. Every other nurse in the room froze solid. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Lena set the tool on the tray with a soft, deliberate click, turned around, and left without a single word. If this is the first time you are hearing my stories, please subscribe and let me know which city you are listening from in the comments. I am really excited to see where this story reaches. Please listen until the very end. I think you will be happy you did. For 11 weeks, Lena Brooks had been a nurse on the trauma floor at Mercy General Hospital. That was 11 weeks of working back-to-back shifts and learning where the best supplies were hidden. It was 11 weeks of memorizing the name of every patient because she felt each person mattered. She always came in 30 minutes before her shift began. That half hour was the key difference between being ready and being rushed. And Lena Brooks had not been rushed for 8 years. But nobody at Mercy General knew that about her. In fact, no one at the hospital really knew her at all, and she wanted to keep it that way. She filled out her forms, she passed all her nursing tests, she arrived early every day, and she never made any waves. Her personnel file stated she was 26 years old. It stated she got her nursing degree from a public college in Virginia. The file also noted her last job was for a government contractor, a job she could not talk about. The Human Resources Office had asked about it only once. A clerk from the office made one phone call. After that single call, the questions stopped forever. What her file did not show was her 4 years served in the United States Marine Corps. It left out that she was a member of a Scout sniper unit that was based at Camp Pendleton. It did not show that she completed 3 separate tours of duty, 2 of which were in locations that are still secret. And it failed to mention she had more confirmed long-range kills than any female soldier in the history of her unit. The file was silent about all of this because she had used the official process to request that her service history be kept private. The Marine Corps, to their great credit, agreed to her request. So here, she was simply a nurse, a capable one, in most people's opinion, and a very quiet one. She kept her dark hair tied back in a neat bun. She did not wear any jewelry or rings, and she kept her nails trimmed short because long nails can create problems. She moved around the hospital the same way she moved in the field. She was smooth, she kept her center of balance low, and her eyes never stopped scanning. She was constantly mapping exits, looking for possible threats, and noting every single face in the room. Her supervisor was a woman named Diane Kowalski, who had been in charge of the trauma floor for 19 years. She had the kind of attitude of a person who had seen everything. In Lena's first week, Diane had told the other nurses that the new girl had talent but lacked experience. She remarked that Lena just needed more time and would likely be fine after a year or two. Lena had overheard the comment, but she said nothing to correct the record. She simply returned to her duties and focused on other matters. The Special Forces unit showed up on a Tuesday at 2:37 in the afternoon. Lena was sure of the time because she was always tracking the time. She was applying a new bandage to a 63-year-old man by the name of Frank. He had fallen off a ladder at his son's house and broken 3 of his ribs. That was when she heard the ambulance bay doors slide open in a way that was wrong. It was not the soft, normal sound of an everyday emergency. This sound was rougher and much quicker. Then she heard boots. They were not work boots. They were not the sound of hospital staff or the quiet shoes of her fellow nurses. These were military boots, striking the floor with an urgency that said their owners were not accustomed to waiting. She finished wrapping Frank's injury, pressed the tape down, and promised him she would be back to check on him in 40 minutes. After that, she stepped into the main corridor. There were 6 of them. They were enormous men, the type of size that comes from endless training, brutal exercise, and very little rest. 3 of them were in civilian outfits that did not hang right because regular clothes never fit men who are built that way. 2 of them still had on parts of their combat uniforms, including armored vests. Their rifles were probably left by the entrance or inside their vehicle. She could not be certain. The 6th man was lying on the gurney. He was the one that mattered. He was unconscious. A bandage was wrapped around his left side, and it had been applied with incredible skill. It was firm and perfectly layered, with 0 mistakes. It was the kind of bandage you learn to wrap while taking enemy fire, not the kind they teach you from a textbook. But red was still soaking through the gauze. This told her the wound was extremely deep and he was still bleeding internally. His skin tone was all wrong. She saw his chest move up and down, but his breathing was weak and uneven. The tallest of the 5 conscious men was doing all the talking. He was about 6 feet 4 inches tall and was as solid as a stone wall. He had a square jaw that looked like it was carved from granite and a scar that ran from his left ear down to his lip. She would find out later that his name was Petty Officer First Class Elias Cord. But in that moment, he was simply the man giving orders, and he was not making any requests. We require a surgeon this instant. Not in 5 minutes. Right this second. The head nurse at the reception desk was a good man named Marcus. He was excellent at his job, but he was not ready for something like this. He said, "Sir, I need to get your patient checked in first." The tall man shot back. "He does not need to be checked in. He needs to be on an operating table. Where is your head surgeon?" "Sir, if you could, please. Where is your surgeon?" It was not a question. Lena watched all the color disappear from Marcus's face. A small, automatic part of her brain registered the positions of all 5 men. She measured the distance to the emergency panic button. She saw that 2 of them were watching the hallway behind them, not the desk. That meant they were not worried about the hospital staff. They were worried about someone who might be following them. That was a very interesting piece of information. That was something worth remembering. Dr. Hartwell was already on her way down the hall. She had heard the boots as well. She appeared around the corner with 2 surgical nurses right behind her. She needed only one glance at the man on the gurney before saying, "Get him to trauma room 2, while pointing down the corridor. Suddenly, everyone was in motion. The Special Forces soldiers moved right along with them. They flanked the gurney on 3 sides like they were still in a combat formation, which they pretty much were. Lena moved with them, but she was not obvious about it. She walked at a normal speed, picked up a patient chart from the station like she had business in that direction, and she slid into trauma room 2 just behind them. All at once, the room was dangerously full. Dr. Hartwell started yelling instructions. Her surgical nurses scrambled to keep up with her commands. 2 of the soldiers took up guard positions by the door without being told. It was either pure instinct or a standing order. She did not know which. The other 2 soldiers entered the room and immediately stood in the way of the medical team, which was about to become a serious issue. Lena moved to the right side of the gurney. She began cutting away the field bandage before anyone had to ask her. She had performed this task many times. Not in a hospital, but she had performed it. The injury underneath was a gunshot wound that had passed clean through his left side. It had missed his spine, but likely struck a kidney. Given the amount of blood, it definitely hit something else as well. She had an intravenous kit in her hand before Dr. Hartwell even called for one. Hartwell snatched it from her without seeing who was handing it to her. Then she looked up, noticed Lena, and immediately focused back on the patient without saying anything. That was the right move. Lena had to respect that. But then Elias Cord placed his hand on her shoulder, and it was not a friendly gesture. His hand felt like a bag of rocks. She felt that pressure, and her entire body went perfectly still. It was a kind of stillness she had learned in combat training, when a small voice in her mind screamed at her to be on alert. "You are a regular nurse," he stated. "This is a surgical case. Leave." She did not even glance at him. His blood pressure is dropping. He needs a second intravenous line, and your soldiers need to clear this room so the doctor has room to work. "I was not asking for your opinion," he said. "I am aware," she answered. He just stared at her. She kept her eyes locked on the patient. Dr. Hartwell's voice sliced through the thick tension. "Somebody get a better light on this, and I need to know this man's blood type. If it is not on file, I need to know that immediately." Without ever looking up from the patient, Lena said, "He is B positive. The information is tattooed on his right forearm." She had spotted it when she cut away his sleeve. For just a moment, there was absolute silence in the room. Dr. Hartwell said, "Excellent. Get his blood tested and matched, just to be safe." Then, in a quieter voice that was still perfectly clear to everyone, she said, "Elias, get your team out of my trauma room. Every last one of them." Elias was obviously unhappy. Lena saw the brief pause before he spoke. "We are not leaving him." "You are not leaving him," she corrected. "You are standing in the hall, out of my team's way while we save his life. That is a very big difference. Now, please move." Another silence followed. Lena felt his gaze on her but refused to turn around. Finally, he stepped back. The door closed. She heard Dr. Hartwell release a tense breath before her voice became all business. It was sharp and precise, requesting vitals and instruments. Lena moved in perfect sync with her. She had a talent for sensing how other people worked. This skill made her invaluable out in the world. She could merge with any team's process, becoming a help instead of a hindrance. They operated as a single unit for 47 minutes. The man on the operating table was Petty Officer Second Class Danny Reyes. Lena knew this because she had seen his dog tag when they prepped him. He had a wound in his side from a blade, sustained less than 4 hours ago. It was not a knife wound, but something significantly longer. Lena kept that observation to herself. She simply passed the surgical tools, checked the monitors, and relayed information to Dr. Hartwell before the doctor even needed to ask. After about 20 minutes, the surgeon no longer questioned the nurse who was assisting her. When everything was done, Danny Reyes was stable and being transferred to the intensive care unit. Dr. Hartwell took off her gloves and just looked at Lena for a long time. "How long have you been on this floor?" the doctor finally asked. 11 weeks, Lena answered. 11 weeks? The doctor offered no other comment. She just turned and departed. Lena tidied her station, logged the supplies that were used, and went back to her other patient, Frank, who was recovering from broken ribs. The SEALs were waiting in the lounge outside the trauma area. All 5 of them were standing. Men of their kind rarely sit in such places. They were stationed around the room in a relaxed formation. As Lena passed the doorway, Elias Cord noticed her. She continued walking without stopping. She caught the sound of him saying something in a low voice to the man next to him. She could not understand the words. She thought again about Danny Reyes's injury, its precise angle and depth. It was caused by something much longer than a typical knife, yet it missed his spine by less than 2 centimeters. That kind of wound is not something that happens in a training exercise. An injury like that occurs when a highly skilled person wants to send a message, not create a casualty. Someone had intended for Danny Reyes to stay alive, at least for a while. She dismissed the thought and went about her duties. The rest of her afternoon was completely ordinary. She changed some dressings. She updated a few patient charts. She spent time with a woman named Pauline on the 4th floor. Pauline was terrified about her upcoming biopsy results and needed a companion more than a nurse. At 6:30, Lena ate part of a sandwich in the staff lounge. She overheard two other nurses talking about a television program she'd never seen. She smiled whenever it felt like the right moment. She was an expert at fitting in. At 7:42, she was at the nursing station on the third floor when she saw the men come in through the main entrance. There were three of them. They did not enter through the ambulance bay, which was the first odd detail. They were dressed in civilian clothes, which was the second. One of them held a bag with a shape that was strange for its intended use. That was the final piece of information that made every one of her senses go on high alert. It was the feeling she was trained for, the feeling she got in the field right before something terrible was about to unfold. She had spent 4 years learning to read people the same way most people read traffic signs. The process was quick, automatic, and certain. She was currently observing three men moving through a public space in a pattern that was clearly planned. They were not glancing around. They did not appear to be lost. They were not there to see a sick relative. They moved with an obvious goal and a distinct formation. One man led the way, with two others positioned behind and to his sides, keeping a set distance. That was military spacing. It was the kind of spacing used for a tactical approach. These men were not from any branch of the American military, because she knew what that looked like. This was something else. They went by the information desk without looking, past the chapel, and then took a left toward the elevators. She knew where they were headed. She pulled out her phone. She sent a text to a number she was not supposed to possess. She had memorized it from a paper she had watched get shredded years ago. The text contained only a single character. The recipients would understand its meaning. Then she walked over to Marcus, who was sitting at his desk, looking drained from his shift. "Hey," she said. "I have a favor to ask." "What is it?" he replied. "I need you to calmly, and I mean very calmly, inform Dr. Hartwell that she might want to relocate her patient in the third-floor intensive care unit. Be cool about it. Do not rush. After that, I need you to find out if anyone here has jurisdiction over those military men in the waiting room." Marcus simply stared at her. "Lena, what are you?" "Will you please do that for me?" she interrupted. "Well, yes, but—" "Thank you," she said, already turning to leave. She headed for the stairs. An elevator is a box, and a box is a trap. She was not about to get caught in a trap on a Tuesday in November, not in a Virginia hospital if she could avoid it. She went up the stairwell, taking the steps two at a time. She moved without a sound, her hand just brushing the handrail. She emerged on the third floor from behind the fire door and paused. It was a long corridor. The nursing station at the other end was staffed by two people. A man she did not recognize stood near the elevators, looking at his phone. But he held the device at an unnatural angle, likely watching the hallway's reflection in the screen. She moved in the other direction. She took the long route around the floor, using a service hallway near the radiology department. She made her way to the intensive care unit from the east wing. Just as she passed through the second set of doors, she nearly collided with Elias Cord. He was leaning against the wall outside Danny's room with his arms crossed. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he could not quite solve. "Floor nurse," he said. "Petty officer," she answered. His focus sharpened. "I never told you my rank." "No," she said evenly. "You did not." He slowly uncrossed his arms. "What are you doing up here?" he questioned. "My job," she said. She kept her tone calm, her hands visible, and her posture non-threatening. "And at this moment, my job is to inform you that 3 men came into the hospital roughly 6 minutes ago. Their movement pattern does not look like any normal civilian behavior I can identify. One of them had a bag. The bag was noticeably weighted on its left side. The change in him was instant. His entire posture shifted. It was not a large or showy motion, but she felt it like a drop in the room's temperature. His entire being became rigid and alert. His voice turned flat and professional. "Where are they?" he demanded. They went left at the elevators on the main floor. "I do not know which floor they chose." The man standing near your elevator on this level has been there since I came up. He is observing the hallway. Elias stared at her for a long moment. It was not a friendly look. It was the expression of a man performing complex calculations at high speed. You need to go back to your floor, he ordered her. You have 4 men, and your security is not complete, she replied. How important is Danny Reyes to the people who put that blade in him? He went perfectly still. How do you know about the blade? He asked. The wound pattern. The entry angle was 40 degrees, with a lateral depth that suggests a blade between 18 and 24 inches long. The path of the blade missed the spine by a margin too narrow to be accidental. That is not an injury from a brawl. That is an injury designed to convey a message. She paused. So, are you going to keep asking me questions, or are you going to secure this floor? For 3 full seconds, Elias Cord did not speak. She mentally counted each one. Then, he grabbed the radio on his belt. His voice was very low and absolutely certain. Ghost Hawk, PIP code lock. 3rd floor is compromised. We have 3 unidentified men in the building, with a possible 4th by the elevator. Reyes will not be moved without my direct order. Please acknowledge. 3 voices responded in quick succession. Acknowledged, acknowledged, acknowledged. He looked back at her. Who are you? He asked. He did not ask what she was or why she knew these things. He had already processed past those questions. He had jumped to a different, more complicated one. It was the type of question you ask only when you realize the person before you is something completely unexpected. She met his stare without flinching. Right now, I am the nurse who knows this floor much better than you do. The supply closet down the east hall has a window overlooking the parking garage. The service stairs on the north side are accessible with a staff key card, and they completely bypass the main elevators. The room 2 doors from Danny's is unoccupied. It has been all day. And the man who was watching your elevator is now heading this way. Elias whipped his head around. She had already vanished. She was inside the empty room before the man was even halfway down the hall. She pressed herself flat against the wall right beside the doorway. She had left the door ajar by about 3 inches. It was the perfect angle to observe the hallway while remaining completely unseen. It was a familiar and useful habit. Lena heard Elias speak in a calm voice, like someone simply asking for the time. Can I help you? The other man answered with an accent she could not quite place. It sounded like it was from Eastern Europe, maybe Russian. It was hard to be sure from only a few words. He said, looking for the restroom. Elias replied, down the hall and to the left. She heard his footsteps go past the door. Through the tiny crack, she saw him. He was a big man in his 50s. He favored his right side as he walked, maybe from an old injury. His right hand hung loosely, but it was tense. It was the forced relaxation of a man keeping his hand ready and away from a weapon. The man turned left at the corner, but the restrooms were the other way. Lena knew this because she had memorized the hospital layout in her first week. When she stepped into the hallway, Elias was already watching the man walk away. Without turning to face her, Elias whispered, he is in the east corridor. There is a service staircase about 50 feet down. He is looking for a good position. Can you beat him there? But Lena was already on the move. The service hall was tight, lit by humming fluorescent bulbs. She moved like a shadow along the wall, her breathing steady. She was becoming a person she had tried to leave behind 4 years ago, on the day she walked out of Camp Pendleton for the last time. But she never really left that person behind. She had just locked that part of herself away. She got to the stairwell door a full 8 seconds before she heard the man's heavy footsteps in the hall. She slid inside, went up 4 steps, and looked back through the wire-enforced glass. He came into the corridor, moving with more purpose now. He reached inside his coat and took something out. It was not a wallet or a phone. It was small and black. He held it like he had held it thousands of times before. She had about 4 seconds, maybe 5. She pushed the door open, stepped behind him, and spoke in a perfectly normal, relaxed voice. "Excuse me, sir, this is a restricted area." He spun around, trying to shove the gun behind his leg. He was thinking fast, deciding if she was a real problem or just in the way. She already knew what he was. The second he moved to raise the weapon, she was gone. She stepped inside his reach as her right hand came up. She did 4 things in quick succession that took less than 2 seconds. It was too fast, too smooth, too skilled for a regular nurse. He collapsed to the floor without a sound. She caught the pistol before it hit the ground. Standing over him, she took 1 deep breath, then another, feeling the quiet that always came after. Further down the hall, Elias Cord was frozen in place. He just stared at her, completely stunned. Behind him, 2 of his men seemed to appear from nowhere, the way elite soldiers do. They took 1 look and understood everything. For a second, nobody said a word. Then one of them, a shorter man called Ghost, looked from the man on the floor to Lena. He asked in a low voice, "What branch were you in?" She calmly felt for the unconscious man's pulse. It was strong. She did not want anyone to die in this hospital. She stood, put the gun in her waistband under her scrubs, and looked at Ghost. "I am a nurse," she said. Ghost shot a look at Elias, who was still staring at her with a totally new expression. It was not the dismissive look he gave her in surgery. It was not the intense focus from the hallway. It was a look she knew from the battlefield. It was the look of a man who suddenly had to question everything he thought he knew. He finally found his voice. "We have 2 more hostiles in the building." "No, 3, she corrected him. "You forgot the one with the bag." "The bag is the target, which means he is not here yet. He is on his way." Right on cue, the radio on Elias's belt came to life. A tense voice said, "We have a problem at the south stairs. 2 men with weapons." And then, from deep inside the building, everything shook. That was not a generator failing or an earthquake. She knew the feeling of an explosion, even through 6 floors of building. It was a small, focused blast, the kind used to break open a door. The sound that followed was not chaos and screaming. It was worse. It was a sudden, terrible silence. Then the fire alarms started to blare, followed by the sound of boots. They were the wrong kind of boots. Not the steady pace of seals, but the heavy, fast stomping of a larger group coming up the south stairs. Elias looked at his men, then looked back at her. She reached up, unclipped her hospital ID, and looked at the tired woman in the picture. She placed the badge on a windowsill. "We have to get Danny Reyes behind 2 locked doors," she said firmly. "I need a vest if you have one, a radio on your team's channel, and a weapon that is more powerful than a handgun." Elias watched her for a moment longer. He then reached back, unhooked the spare radio from his belt, and gave it to her. She took the device. It was still warm as she clipped it onto her collar. The feeling against her skin was strangely familiar, a sensation she had fought to forget. But she had no time for memories now. "The south stairwell is compromised," she stated. That means their entry point was the parking garage. The bomb was set on the access door between the 2nd parking level and the service hallway. It is a door made of reinforced steel. They would have needed a special explosive to open it that fast, which means they planned to enter this way. They know the building's layout. Ghost asked, "How do you know it was that specific door?" "Because it is the only door on that side of the building without a camera on it," she answered. Her eyes on Elias. Whoever planned this did their research. They have been in this building before. Elias's jaw tightened. "How many of them?" "I saw 3, and there was a driver, so at least 4. Possibly up to 6. The man with the bag is the last piece. If he is not inside, he is either waiting for a go signal, or he is the one who set the bomb." She let that sink in. The bag is what this is all about. What I said before is true. Whatever is in it is a game changer. "Why do you say that?" Elias asked. "Because the other men were not carrying anything important. They are the diversion. He is the real target. Another SEAL, a powerfully built man with a scar on his hand, spoke. Elias, we have to move Reyes now. She already gave you the location, Lena said. 2 locked doors. Take him to the intensive care unit. There is a secondary room there with a key card lock and a heavy door. Put him inside. Put 2 of your men on the door and lock it from the inside. Nobody comes in or out until I hear your voice on the radio. The man with the scar looked to Elias for confirmation. Elias looked at Lena. She could see his mind racing, his entire plan falling apart and being rebuilt around her. He finally gave the commands. Hawk, Pip, get Reyes to that room. Do not let anyone near that door. He turned to Ghost. South stairwell. You are with me. Finally, he looked at Lena. You take the north side, she answered. I need to know what is in that bag. So do I, he said. Then let us find the man who is carrying it before your team does. And let's do it quietly, because if he feels like he is trapped in a hospital full of civilians— I know, Elias interrupted. Do you really? She challenged him. Because your team's tactics will push him into a corner. And a man with that bag, when he is cornered, will do something that no one can ever undo. Elias was quiet for 2 full seconds. The only sounds were the distant alarms and the faint noise of panic from the floors below. You are saying we should not spook him? Elias asked. I am saying you should let me find him first. And what happens then? He asked after a moment. Then I will give you his position, and your team can take him down however you see fit. Just let me find him. Ghost let out a short, surprised sound that was almost a laugh. It was the sound of someone being forced to accept a crazy new truth. She had heard that sound many times before. Elias finally gave in. You will check in on the radio every 3 minutes. If you miss a single check-in, I am coming to get you. I understand. With that, she headed north. The North Hall was much calmer. The alarms were not as loud here. The lights were still working, which told her the explosion had been carefully contained. She knew she was dealing with true professionals. Professionals only use the exact amount of force they need. A small blast to open 1 door, just enough men to control the area, and they keep things as quiet as possible until it is time to act. She passed a linen closet and an empty exam room. She glanced into the nurse's station as she went by. It was deserted, except for a rolling supply cart. 2 of its drawers had been left open. That meant someone had been here very recently and left in a hurry. She stopped and went back to look. The cart had 2 open drawers. The bottom one, which held the emergency trauma kits, was completely empty. She stood there, perfectly still, and wondered why a person who was not a nurse would need a trauma kit. It was obvious what had happened. Someone was injured. An attack had occurred between the parking garage and this very floor, and now they were in hiding. She scanned the corridor, seeing nothing on the clean white tiles. But as she knelt and tilted her head, the light revealed a small, dark smear close to the wall. The mark was about 6 inches long and looked fresh. She rose and moved silently down the hallway toward the north stairwell door 8 feet away. Reaching it, she pressed her back flat against the wall, a motion from her training. She held her breath and listened. From the other side came the sound of labored breathing, strained and uneven. Someone was definitely fighting through pain. Her eyes were fixed on the door handle. The handle began to rotate slowly from the other side. She took 2 steps back to face the entrance directly. She folded her hands before her, adopting the patient posture of a nurse. In a completely steady voice, she called out, "Sir, is everything all right in there?" The handle froze. After a beat of silence, the door swung open. The man who emerged was not who she pictured. She had to instantly revise her strategy, but she was quick on her feet. He was a young man, perhaps in his mid-30s. His face, which might have once been kind, was now a tight mask of tension, concealing a secret he was desperate to protect. He gripped the strap of a bag with both hands, holding it tight against his right side. His left hand trembled, not from fright, but from significant blood loss. A sealed trauma kit from a nearby cart was clipped to his belt, useless to him. He could not treat his wound while clutching the bag so desperately. He saw her and stopped cold. She offered him the same calm expression she gave all her patients, a look that promised she was in control. "You are injured," she said plainly. He remained silent. "Your left side," she continued. "The wound appears to be just below your ribs." Her eyes drifted to where he pressed his left arm tightly against his torso. "You must have that wound treated," she instructed him, "or you will lose too much blood to accomplish your goal here." His eyes darted around, evaluating her as a threat. He searched for a weapon or a radio, and his gaze landed on the device on her collar. His face hardened. "Who are you reporting to?" he asked sharply. "My team," she stated. He let out a disbelieving scoff. "You are a nurse. Nurses do not have teams," she replied with a cool tone. "This one does." She took one careful step closer, her hands always visible. Her voice was firm. "I will not harm you. I need you to know that. Regardless of your purpose, there are 63 patients on this floor. 42 more are on the level below us. They have no part in this. Now, let me see that injury," she pressed. He simply shook his head. "The patients are not my concern." "I am aware of that," she replied. "You are here about Danny Reyes." In that moment, the careful control on his face completely broke. It was the expression of a person who had carried a great weight alone for too long, only to find someone who shared his secret. She recognized that look and knew she was correct. The wound was not meant to be fatal. It was a warning. It also meant he knew Danny Reyes not as a mission, but as something personal. "What is in that bag?" she questioned. He stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Proof," he said. She waited for him to say more. "Is it proof of who was behind the attack?" she asked gently. He shook his head again. "It proves why it happened. This documentation points to a name so powerful that no one will believe it otherwise." He pushed his left arm harder into his side, and she noticed his face lose all color for a second. "The people who sent them do not want me dead. They want this bag. The bag is evidence of what they have done. It shows what they ordered." His voice became weak as the blood loss affected him. "You see, there is a difference. The knife was punishment. The real crime is the cover-up." Just then, the radio on her collar crackled to life. Elias's voice came through, calm and clear. "North Team, report your status." The man's attention snapped to her radio. She held his gaze as she lifted a hand to the device. "North is clear," she reported. "I am with an injured civilian requiring medical aid." He entered via the north stairs. She paused, then added, "He poses no threat. Stand down." The reply was immediate. "Coming in 3 seconds." "Understood. We are holding our position." "You have 2 minutes." She extended her open hand toward the man. "Give me the bag," she said. His grip on the strap became even tighter. "Not to take it from you," she clarified. "You cannot hold it and let me dress that wound. You will collapse in about 6 minutes if I do not stop the bleeding. I will keep the bag safe." "It will stay on this floor," she assured him. "But you must let me do my job." He looked from her outstretched hand to her face. She remained perfectly still, aware that any sudden motion would be perceived as hostile. At last, he extended the bag toward her. She took it and was surprised by its weight. She set it on the floor next to her foot, then guided him to sit down against the wall. Taking the trauma kit from his belt, she broke the seal and began to work. The wound was a clean cut, 5 inches long and deep. It had missed a major artery, but not by much. Her hands moved with speed and precision as she worked. Through a clenched jaw, he asked, "How can I be sure you will not just give them the bag?" "You cannot," she answered truthfully. but I have a very good idea of its contents. I know who it implicates, and I know Danny Reyes almost died for it. You can either trust that I grasp its importance, or you can choose not to. Either way, I am stopping this bleeding, because that is my duty. He made a sound that was nearly a laugh. You are more than just a nurse. I am a nurse, exactly, she corrected, but I am also other things. After she secured the pressure dressing, his breathing was more stable, though he was pale. She stood, retrieved the bag, and offered him a hand up. He accepted it. As they came around the corner, Elias and Ghost were waiting. The look on Elias's face as he saw her helping the man, with the bag in her other hand, was complex. It was not anger, but profound confusion. He looked like someone whose entire understanding of the world was being challenged. Ghost's focus went directly to the bag. Is that it? He asked. Yes, she confirmed. We need a secure place for this, and I need someone with the correct clearance to receive it. I am not giving these documents to just anyone in this building. She looked straight at Elias. That means you should place a call immediately, she stated. I am already on it, he said, showing her his phone. The man she had helped, who still had not shared his name, leaned wearily against the wall. What about the other three? He asked. 2 are secured in the south stairwell, Ghost reported. She handled the third one. The man nodded. A 4th man is waiting outside in a vehicle. He is holding a remote. Elias glanced up from his phone. A remote for what? Before the injured man could respond, she spoke. The device on parking level P2 was for the door. If there is a remote outside, that was just a distraction. There is another, much larger device, the man confirmed, his voice low. It is attached to a support column between parking levels P1 and P2. It has a timer and a remote trigger. The countdown began when they entered. A heavy silence filled the hallway. How much time? She asked. He met her gaze. It started 19 minutes ago, right when I came through that stairwell door. She looked at Elias, who was already turning to go. Ghost, evacuate everyone in this building to the east wing. This is not a drill. Move all patients and staff now. He walked quickly, speaking into his phone with a quiet intensity she knew well it was the voice of a man taking command of a crisis. I require explosive ordnance disposal at the parking structure immediately. We have a secondary device on a P1 structural column, and the timer is active. Yes. I mean right now. She was already calculating the time in her head. 19 minutes had passed, minus their conversation. That left maybe 14 minutes, possibly less. She turned to the injured man. Can you walk? Yes, he confirmed. Then let us go. She handed the heavy bag back to him. Hold on to this until someone with proper authority arrives. Do you understand? Do not put it down. Do not give it to anyone unless Elias personally makes the introduction. He accepted the bag. Why do you trust me with this again? He asked. She looked directly at him. Because you already bled for it. People who bleed for a cause do not surrender it easily, she explained. Also, I have another job to do. She left his side and caught up to Elias in 4 long strides. He was still on his call, but acknowledged her with a glance. There was a new understanding in his eyes, an earned respect from the last 20 minutes. She felt the shift. She spoke softly. The driver outside is holding the remote. Bomb disposal will handle the area, he said. Their best time is 12 minutes away, she countered. Our timer is at 14 minutes, if we are lucky. That gives us a 2-minute window, assuming my math is correct. She matched his brisk pace. And that driver will not stay put when he sees this entire building being cleared out. He was reaching for the remote, not the timer. This meant someone had to create a distraction until the bomb squad arrived. Elias froze right where he stood. Lena stopped with him. As they faced each other in the hall, she could see him thinking. A part of him wanted to send her away, to see her only as the nurse she appeared to be. But that part was losing to the man who just watched her be someone else for 40 minutes. He finally asked, "What is your real name?" He meant before she was Lena Brooks, before this hospital. She looked him in the eye. "Corporal Lena Brooks, Scout Sniper, 4th Marine Regiment. 3 deployments." She let the words hang in the air. "I am a very good shot, Elias." He held her gaze for a long time, measuring everything about her. Then he finally spoke. "There is a rifle in a duffel bag inside our vehicle. It is parked in the ambulance bay," he added. "It has a level 3 access lock. The code is the year the Marine Corps was founded, with 2 zeros at the end." She replied instantly, 1775. He said, "You have 12 minutes." She was already on the move. The stairwell was empty, and she descended 4 floors in less than 30 seconds. She pushed through the service door into the ambulance bay, moving with a speed that did not look like running but covered the distance just as quickly. The SEAL team's black sport utility vehicle was at the far end. She got to it, pulled the duffel from the back, and opened the lock in 3 seconds. Inside was a Mark 12 special-purpose rifle, perfectly set up for precision shots, suppressed and loaded. She ran her hands over it, like greeting an old friend she never expected to see again. She took the rifle out, slung it over her shoulder, and moved to the edge of the ambulance bay. From that position, she could see the parking garage entrance and the street, but she remained hidden. It took her 40 seconds to locate the target's vehicle. It was an ordinary black sedan parked on the north side of the street with a perfect view of the garage entrance. The engine was running, and one person sat inside. She found her place behind a concrete pillar. She had made shots from much worse positions than this, far worse, in the wind and rain, with moving targets hundreds of meters away and only her own steady hand. This shot was barely 80 meters. The car's window was lightly tinted, which made things more difficult, but not impossible. She looked through the scope. The driver was watching the building entrance, holding a phone in his right hand. She could see him looking at the screen. He was probably waiting for a signal from his partners inside, a call that was never going to come. She took a deep breath, let half of it out, and held her aim steady. The radio on her collar clicked 2 times. That was Elias. 2 clicks was the signal to hold your fire. She waited for 3 seconds, then 5. She watched the driver's phone through her scope, thinking of Danny Reyes on the operating table, his injury, a clear warning. She also thought of the 63 patients on the 3rd floor and the 42 patients on the floors below. And she thought about that bag, the one that held proof of a secret so important that a Navy SEAL's life was a fair price to protect it. The driver looked down at his phone, his thumb moving toward the screen. She maintained her position. She did not have to fire yet. All she needed was 10 more seconds, only 10. She had learned a long time ago that the hardest part of her job was not taking the shot, it was the waiting. The phone in his hand lit up. He glanced at it, then at the building, then back at his phone. She counted silently. 1, 2, 3. From the east side of the building, she could hear voices. It was the staff moving patients. The evacuation was now clearly visible. Through the east-facing windows, she could see people being moved, and the driver saw it too. She watched him understand what was happening, and she watched him make his decision. His thumb moved. She fired. The shot was muffled by the suppressor, but it was not completely silent. It is never completely silent. The sedan's window shattered, and the phone flew onto the dashboard. The driver's hand was not near it. She had not aimed at the phone, and she had not aimed at the driver. She had fired through the front wheel well, striking the vehicle's axle. The car was now impossible to move, and the impact set off every alarm, giving the driver a new problem to deal with. In the 5 seconds of confusion that followed, she heard the bomb squad announce their arrival on the radio. She let out a slow breath, stood up, and slung the rifle back over her shoulder. The radio clicked once. It was Elias. 1 click meant all clear. She stood in the ambulance bay, the cool night air on her skin, listening as the hospital evacuated around her. She thought about that gray November morning she left Camp Pendleton, telling herself she was done with that life. It turned out she was not done at all. She had simply found a new battleground. Inside the hospital, a woman named Pauline was likely back to worrying about her biopsy results. And Frank, with his 3 broken ribs, would need his bandages changed. And Dr. Hartwell was somewhere in that chaos, making sure all of her patients were safe. The building was still standing because 12 minutes ago, a man she treated in a hallway trusted her with a bag of evidence, and she had trusted him in return. She unclipped her hospital badge from the windowsill where she'd set it down. Someone had quietly placed it on a supply cart nearby. She had no idea who. She clipped it back onto her scrubs. She turned and walked back into the hospital, right into the controlled chaos of a building evacuating half its population. She walked past moving beds, intravenous poles, and confused patients in gowns. The staff, who knew everything, were holding it all together with a mix of training and adrenaline that Lena understood very well. It was the same way she had lived for 4 years. If anyone noticed the rifle on her back, they glanced at it and then quickly looked away. Looking away is what people do when reality gets to be too much. She took the rifle off her back, held it under her arm with the barrel facing down, and found the first nurse she knew. Her name was Teresa, a good nurse with 2 years of experience and a calm nature. Lena asked, "Who is still on the 3rd floor?" Teresa was pushing a wheelchair with one hand while holding a chart in the other. She looked at Lena, then at the rifle, and answered, "About 6 patients who are too hard to move without a full team." "Diane is still up there." "Anyone else?" Lena questioned. Dr. Hartwell went back up. She said she wouldn't leave her post-op patients by themselves. Of course she had. Lena took the rifle to the supply closet behind the nursing station. She locked it inside using her staff key and then made her way to the stairs. The 3rd floor was much quieter now. The beds closest to the exits were gone. The 6 remaining patients were the ones attached to too many tubes and monitors, machines that could not be disconnected without a doctor's approval. They were just too fragile to be moved into the hall. Diane was at the main nursing station, a phone held tightly to her ear. She had the look of a woman who had managed crises her whole life, and this was just another one. Her jaw was tight, her eyes were focused, and she had no time for distractions. She saw Lena and said into the phone, "Just a moment." She turned to Lena. "Where have you been?" "Working." Lena answered simply. Diane just looked at her for a second. It was the look of a supervisor with 19 years of experience, looking at a nurse she considered capable but new. But now, that nurse stood there with dried blood on her arm and a sense of calm that seemed less like a personality trait and more like training. Diane turned back to the phone. "We need a full trauma team on 3 for a transport. I have 6 post-op patients who can't be moved, and I need them out in the next." She looked at Lena. 8 minutes, Lena said. Maybe 10. Diane repeated the message, hung up, and said, "The bomb squad is in the parking structure. I know. They will find it." The second device is on the main support column. It's on a timer with a remote, but the remote is now disabled. She walked to the first of the patients who were left without waiting for Diane to ask how she knew that. The patient was a 71-year-old man named Warren. He was admitted 3 days ago for a heart condition. He was fully awake and looked at Lena with the sharp understanding of someone who has lived long enough to recognize when things are serious. "Are we in trouble?" he asked. "We are being careful," Lena told him. "There is a big difference." "Yes," he agreed. "We are being careful." She checked his tubes and his monitor and started to figure out how to move him with a portable machine. Behind her, Dr. Hartwell rushed through the fire door, already putting on gloves. She went directly to a patient's room down the hall without saying a word. That was exactly like Hartwell. That was Dr. Hartwell, always working with surgical precision and a clear purpose. As Lena adjusted Warren's intravenous pole, Elias Kaur came through the same fire door. He moved with a different kind of presence than when he had arrived that afternoon. Back then, he was a powerful, dismissive man who acted as if he owned every room he walked into. He was still powerful, but the dismissiveness was gone. In its place was a look of tiredness and respect, the unease of a man who had been wrong about something important. He walked directly to Lena, not to Diane or Hartwell. He spoke to her. The bomb squad has a visual on the device. This was far more difficult than anyone had realized. They needed 11 minutes to succeed. The clock showed they only had 7. "I am aware," she said. Her eyes locked on his. Could they shut down the timer from a distance? Not this model. It had a mechanical trigger with a digital backup. They had to get their hands on it, so their only option was to be faster. They were doing their best to be faster. She went back to Warren to finish adjusting his IV drip. Warren watched Elias with a knowing look, the kind that could identify a military man no matter the disguise. He asked quietly, "Young man, is this hospital going to be here in 10 minutes?" Elias met his stare. For an instant, his soldier's mask slipped, showing something more vulnerable. He answered, "Sir, we are doing everything humanly possible to make sure it is." Warren thought about that for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Okay. I trust you." His eyes moved from Lena to Elias and back again. Warren settled into his pillow. "If that is the case, then I have nothing to worry about." Lena kept her face perfectly still, showing no emotion. She moved on to care for the next patient. Ghost arrived 2 minutes after Elias. The 2 men stood near the nurse's station, their voices low and intense. Lena kept working, checking her other patients and planning the evacuation order. She caught fragments of their discussion. She heard the name Vasek, the patient she treated earlier, now in a secure room on the 2nd floor with 2 soldiers guarding him. She also heard them relay a phone number to someone probably being woken up halfway across the world. Ghost said something about 2 men in the south stairway that she could not fully hear, but it sounded like the problem was handled. Then, she heard Elias ask a question. Where did she get her military training? Ghost answered. I pulled her file. Camp Pendleton's scout sniper, 4 years, 3 tours of duty. Her old C.O. said she was the finest he had ever trained. He also said she left the service on her own terms, and he never found out the reason. After a brief silence, Elias spoke again. I believe I understand the reason. His voice was softer now, not the usual commanding tone. Lena continued her duties. With 6 minutes and 40 seconds to go, the radio on Elias's hip crackled to life. A voice said, "The package is safe." I say again, the secondary package has been disabled. The clock was stopped with 4 minutes and 11 seconds left. Lena heard Diane let out a shaky sigh of relief behind her. She also heard Dr. Hartwell whisper something that was either a prayer or a curse. On a day like today, there was not much difference between the two. But Lena just kept working. Warren's intravenous line still needed to be watched. The patient in the next room was due for her pain medication in 40 minutes. And the man in the corner recovering from surgery had a low-grade fever that had been overlooked while they were all focused on survival. Those responsibilities did not just vanish because the main threat was gone. That was something people never understood about the world she came from. A crisis does not wipe the slate clean. It just makes more work for everyone. Elias walked over to her. She was reading a patient's chart and did not raise her head. She held the chart up between them like a shield, and she knew exactly what she was doing, though she did not have time to wonder why. He said, "You can relax now." I am relaxed. This is what relaxing looks like for me. He was quiet for a second. She could feel him watching her. That was another trait of men like him. It was a quality she knew well, but it still made her uneasy. They had a way of studying people with a completely thorough gaze, noticing every little thing without having to ask. He finally said, Vasek told us what he is carrying in that bag. She turned a page in the medical chart. I already have a good idea what is in it. No, I mean, he told us who gave the command. She stopped turning pages. She still did not look at him, but her body went completely still. How high up the chain does this go? High enough to change the next 6 months for many people. He paused for effect. High enough that the team that came here tonight will not be the last ones trying to find that bag. At that, she finally looked up from the chart. He was standing much closer than she had realized. They were nearly the same height. At 5 feet 9 inches, she often surprised men as large as Elias. She had a presence that made her height seem like a choice, not a coincidence. She asked, "Are you telling me that this is not over?" "I am telling you that Vasek has to deliver that bag to the correct people, and he has to do it very soon. He is going to need protection, and my team will be the ones to give it." He stopped, and she knew there was more. But the people who sent this team will know they have failed. They will know where they failed. And they are going to be very curious about who was in this building that should not have been. He looked right at her. Which means they are going to be curious about you. She set the chart down on the counter. She did it with deliberate care, like someone clearing their hands for action. Are you saying that I am a problem that needs to be solved? I am saying it would be wise for you to be somewhere else tomorrow morning. She looked at him for a long, silent moment. The overhead lights gave off a quiet hum. Further down the hall, a patient called out for medicine. Warren was watching them with the calm interest of a man who had seen enough in his 70 years to understand what was happening. Lena said, 11 weeks ago, I came to this hospital to help people. I did not choose this job because it was without risk, or because I believed I would be untouchable here. She picked the chart back up. I am going to complete my shift. Elias just stared at her. He opened his mouth to say something, but then he closed it. A detail she found very interesting. Men like Elias Core were not often speechless. Just then, Ghost appeared in the doorway. We've got an issue, he said. The issue was Danny Ray's, but it had nothing to do with his health. Danny's medical condition was improving, his blood pressure was stabilizing, and the operation was a complete success. The problem was with the 2 soldiers Elias had stationed outside of his room. One of them, a man with burn scars named Pip, had found a 3rd man in the intensive care wing. That person was not supposed to be there after they had locked the area down. He was a hospital janitor named Gerald, who had worked the night shift for 11 years. He had his employee badge, he was wearing his uniform, and he had a very good excuse for being on that floor. The only problem was that Pip had caught him with his ear pressed against Danny's door, listening. By the time Lena and Elias reached the intensive care wing, Gerald was sitting in a chair in the hallway. Pip was standing over him, while another soldier guarded the exit. Gerald was talking a mile a minute. He seemed to realize just how suspicious this looked, and was trying desperately to explain it all away. I was just making my rounds, that's it. I thought I heard something, so I leaned closer. Anybody would do the same thing. Pip did not move a muscle and said nothing. He was one of those men who was perfectly at ease in total silence. Gerald looked up and saw Lena. His face changed, but it was not a look of relief. It was something that resembled it, but was not quite the same. You have to tell them, he pleaded with her. You have to tell them I belong here. You know who I am. And it was true. She did. She had seen Gerald many times, pushing his cleaning cart down the corridors late at night, giving a small nod to the staff. She had filed him away in her mind, the way she did with everyone. His face, his physical size, his habits. Gerald always clocked in at 11. He always took his break at 1:30. He was usually done with the 3rd floor by 3 o'clock in the morning, but it was not yet 1:30. And he was not supposed to be on this floor, she asked him. Gerald, which manager told you to start on this floor tonight? He just stared at her. What are you talking about? Your route doesn't put you on the 3rd floor until after 2 o'clock. You are here almost 2.5 hours early. Who gave you the order? His frantic talking came to a halt. She could see the gears turning in his head as he tried to figure out his next move, and she watched him make the wrong one. He tried a new lie. I covered a shift for someone. Martinez asked me to trade with him. Martinez clocked out sick at 4 o'clock this afternoon, Lena said, her voice steady. I saw him on his way out. A heavy silence fell over the hallway. Gerald said nothing. From behind her, Elias spoke. Gerald, this is your last chance to make this whole situation easier for yourself. Gerald's eyes darted from Elias to Pip, then landed back on Lena. She saw the fight drain out of him. It was the expression of a man who had run out of choices and was simply waiting for the consequences. He finally spoke. I was just supposed to get his room number. That was it. Only the room number. I had no idea what they were going to do. He stopped and swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. They promised me it was only for information. Who promised you? Elias demanded. I do not know his name. The man called me 2 days ago, and he somehow already knew all about Gerald. He looked down at the floor. When he looked back up, his face was filled with a pain much deeper than his job could ever cause. He knew about my son and the money he owes to very impatient people. The man on the phone said I just had to make a few calls at the right time and tell them who was on this floor. He swore that nobody was going to get hurt. Lena looked at him, and she knew the part about his son was the truth. She was absolutely certain of it. It was a common tactic for powerful people to force others to do their terrible work. They were experts at finding a person's biggest vulnerability. And for Gerald, they had definitely found it. They found his weakness and used it against him. It did not excuse what he did, but it explained it. Lena asked, Gerald, what about the number from the man who called? He told her, the number was blocked. Did the call come to your cell? Or to the hospital phone? Gerald's face shifted as he looked at her. She had seen that look on Vasic and Elias before. It was the moment someone realizes their own mistake and sees the truth. My cell phone. The number might be hidden, but the call log has data. A forensics team can extract it in about 40 minutes. She looked over at Ghost, who was standing in the doorway. Get his phone to the person handling Vasic's evidence. Ghost glanced at Elias, who nodded once. Gerald stood up slowly, his eyes on Lena. Can they save my son? She answered. I cannot make any promises. But if that number is what I think it is, you will have leverage. You have no power right now. Make them see how important your information is. He nodded, seeming to age right before her eyes. He had made a horrible choice for a noble cause, and that burden would stay with him forever. She understood that weight completely. Hawk gently led Gerald by the arm toward the stairs. Elias watched her. Elias had been observing her all night. She was starting to get used to it. He commented, You handled that situation perfectly. He is not a bad man. She corrected him. He was a useful man. There is a difference. How were you so sure he would tell the truth about the number? Because he is not the kind of man who can create a convincing lie when cornered. The truth was his only option left. She paused. I also saw his hands when I mentioned the supervisor. Most people reach for their phone to prove a story. He did not. He knew he had no proof, and he knew that I could see it. Elias said nothing for a moment. Then he said, You have been doing that all evening. Doing what exactly? Reading people like they are pages in a book. She almost blurted out something too real, but caught herself. Instead, she offered, It is a useful skill for emergency care. It is useful in a lot of places. She met his gaze. His voice was not idle. It was deliberate. It was how expert operators talk when they need a favor. They guide the discussion so you are ready to agree before they even ask. She cut in. Whatever you are planning to ask, just stop. I have not said anything, but you are going to. He studied her for a long time before he spoke. Danny will need protection when he leaves here. A team is being assembled. The attackers from tonight will try again. The proof in Vasik's bag means nothing unless Danny is alive to testify. He heard the order. He lived. And they know he lived, she said flatly. So you want me to quit? I want you to consider that your skills are being wasted here. She almost laughed, but managed to suppress it. This was not the moment, and she knew if she started, she might not stop. She knew this feeling from her past life. The feeling that came after the adrenaline faded. 11 weeks ago, she began. I chose to take this position. I know why. It was not because I was tired or defeated. I chose it because I wanted to fix what other people break. My job is not less important than yours. It is just different. Elias was silent for a second. He did not try to debate her, which was a small surprise. Then he spoke. Pauline is on the 4th floor. She has been waiting 3 days for biopsy results. Lena went still. How do you know about her? Marcus told me. He mentioned you sat with her for an hour last week. He waited a beat. He also said you were the only one who did. She stared at him. The corridor was silent, except for the two of them and Pip at the desk. The hospital was settling back into its routine. There was the steady sound of machines, the shuffling of feet, and the quiet murmurs of people who were still here, still alive, and still in need of care. She stated, Danny Reyes needs his dressings changed in the morning. Elias nodded. After that, he needs a full discharge plan with continuing care. The next person on his case must know his injuries and treatment. I am the best person in this hospital to write that report. You are. So, I will do that first, and then I will give you my answer. He agreed. He started to leave, but then stopped and faced her again. He said, For what it is worth, what I said back in the operating room, when I told you to get out. He paused, picking his words with care. I was wrong. She watched him. That was not an easy admission for a man like him. She could see how hard that was for him to say. There was no act, no show, just a plain fact he had accepted from the evidence. She said, You were doing what you had to do. No, I was arrogant. Sometimes those two things go together. A corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, but not quite. No, he admitted. I guess they are not. She went back to check on her patients. Warren was asleep, which was a very good sign. His vitals were steady, he had better color, and his hands were calm on top of the covers. His body finally felt secure enough to sleep. Lena stood at the foot of his bed, just watching him breathe. It brought her a quiet, profound sense of peace. Next, she went to Pauline's room. Pauline was awake and sitting up. The television was dark. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and her face held the look of someone who had tried to figure out her future until the numbers stopped adding up. She glanced up when Lena came in. Is everything over? All that commotion? It is over, Lena said. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down for the first time in 4 hours. Pauline looked at her for a moment. She was 61, and her face was no longer just pretty. It was something deeper now. It was a face that carried the story of her life, and she wore it with dignity. Pauline observed, You look like you have been through a battle. It was a long night. I do not mean the hospital work. Pauline spoke with a directness that came from having no time for empty chatter. You seem like a person who has done this before, not the patient care, the other business, whatever that was. Lena glanced at her own hands, which she had washed 2 times. I did it a lot in my old life. Tonight reminded me that used to does not always mean over. Pauline paused, then shared. My daughter always said I should have been a nurse. She tells me I am good at taking care of others. She stopped. I think I became an accountant because I was afraid to care that much. Lena met her eyes. So how has that worked out? A small smile touched Pauline's mouth. Not great, to be honest. It turns out you care about people anyway, whether you plan to or not. Yes, Lena said softly. It does seem that way. They were quiet together in the room. The heart monitor beeped a steady rhythm, and down the hallway, the hospital was finding its balance again. That is what hospitals do. They absorb disasters and keep going because that is their purpose, and it is the purpose of the people inside them. Lena thought about Elias's offer, the bag of evidence, Danny Reyes's wounds, and a cloudy morning at Camp Pendleton. So much time had passed. She considered everything but found no easy answer. And she was still right there when Pauline's phone vibrated with a call from the laboratory. She stayed while Pauline took the call, and she held her hand when the update came. It was the kind of news that required a hand to hold. It was good news. Pauline's tests were negative. There was no cancer. The lump was just a simple cyst, a quiet fear she had carried for months. Now it was just a cyst, not a monster. Pauline started to weep with the deep, shaking relief of someone who had been holding her breath since Thursday and could finally breathe again. Lena just held her hand. She did not say it would all be fine. That is a promise no one can keep. And Pauline was too wise for empty words. So Lena simply stayed with her. It was all that was needed. She knew from long ago that sometimes the best thing you can offer is to just be there and not leave. Lena finally left Pauline's room a little after midnight. Pauline was on the phone with her daughter, first crying and then laughing at herself. She said thank you to Lena 3 times, and Lena accepted it every time. She understood that rejecting someone's thanks is a form of unkindness. Walking down the corridor, she felt the hospital's deep night calm. It was a unique quiet, filled with the weight of vulnerable people being watched over by a team fueled by coffee and dedication. They were all here because they knew their work was important. It was always important. The third-floor nurses' station appeared normal again, but that was just on the outside. All the furniture was in its proper place. The monitors beeped in a steady rhythm and the charts were stacked perfectly. But something essential had shifted. It felt like a room after an earthquake, where nothing is broken but everything feels wrong. Marcus sat at the desk. He looked up as she came closer, and his face was different. It was a look she had never seen in 11 weeks. He was not looking at someone capable but new. This look was older, quieter, and much harder to read. He just said, "They need you downstairs," she asked. "Which unit?" "The big one, the trauma center." So she went downstairs. Elias was waiting in the family consultation room, the most private space in the hospital aside from a patient room. Ghost and Pip were in the room, and so was the man she secretly called Hawk. A 5th person was there who she did not know. It was a woman in street clothes, with a government ID clipped to her jacket. She sat with a tense stillness, the kind you see in people who know one wrong word could change everything. A bag sat on the table in front of them. Lena looked from the bag to the woman. Lena asked, "Who are you?" The woman answered, "My name is Carver. That is the only name you will need. I was on an airplane when I received the call and have been awake for 22 hours, so let us get straight to the point." She opened a folder on the table. "Corporal Lena Brooks, 4th Marine Regiment Scout Sniper. You completed 3 deployments. 2 of them were classified. You have 17 confirmed long-range kills, with many more that are not in the official record. You received an honorable discharge last November. You began working as a registered nurse at Mercy General about 11 weeks ago." She looked up from her file. "Did I forget anything?" Lena pulled out a chair and sat down. Nobody had offered her a seat, but nobody tried to stop her. "You missed the part where I put down my rifle on purpose." Carver did not react. "I did not miss it. I made a note of it." Her voice was not unkind, but it was extremely efficient. She sounded like a person who learned that kindness and efficiency do not always go together. "I would like to understand why you believe that is not important tonight. Tonight it is very important. Your actions tonight do not belong to someone who was done with that life. They belong to someone who put down their rifle to pick up a different tool." She paused for a moment. "I need to know what you chose." Lena looked at her, then she glanced over at Elias. He stood by the wall with his arms down, looking like a man who was told to be present but not to get involved. She looked at the bag on the table. She said, "I chose not to be the person who ends life. I wanted to be the one who helps it continue. The world has more than enough destroyers. I did not think it had enough of the other kind," she continued. "I still believe that is true." Carver was silent for a moment, writing in her folder. "The documents inside this bag," she said, "will start a federal investigation. It will bring in at least 3 government agencies and maybe 2 foreign intelligence services. The man who gave the order to kill Petty Officer Reyes is named in these papers. He is currently a deputy director at an agency I will not mention here." She paused again. "By morning, he will realize his plan has failed. By tomorrow afternoon, he will know this bag is real. He will use every power he has to make sure it is never used against him," Lena said. "He already tried that earlier this evening. Tonight was a desperate plan using whoever was available. What is coming next will not be so messy." Carver looked straight at her. "That is why I must talk with you about what happens when you return to work tomorrow." Lena knew exactly what she would say. "You are going to tell me not to go. I am going to tell you that if you do go, you must understand the danger you are putting yourself in. I already told Elias I am going to finish my shift." Carver looked at Elias, who said nothing. She turned back to Lena. "There are protocols for this situation. We can take you to a secure location." "No," Lena said with firmness. "Corporal, I am not a corporal anymore," she stated, her voice completely steady. "I am a nurse at Mercy General. My patient on the 4th floor just learned she does not have cancer, and she will need a follow-up appointment. Warren in room 12 is due for another heart check at 6 in the morning. Danny Reyes needs his bandages changed at 7 and his discharge papers processed by 9. She cleared her throat. "And I am the most qualified person in this hospital to do all of those jobs. So, whatever help you need for this investigation, I will provide it. But after that, I am going back to my work." The room became perfectly still. From his corner, Ghost made a strange noise, somewhere between a cough and a lanif, but it did not become either one. Carver observed her for a long, quiet moment. At last, she said, "Very well. I need your complete account of what happened tonight. Begin from the moment you noticed the 3 men coming into the hospital. Tell me about every choice, everything you saw, and every action you performed. We are going to be in here for a while." They were there for 90 minutes. Lena gave her story the same way she was trained to report after a mission. It was chronological, it was precise, and she gave no opinions. She only reported what she knew for a fact at the time. She gave the position and movement of every person she was watching. She described Vasik's wound, her assessment of it, and what it meant as a message. She described Gerald with that same precise detail. She explained what she observed, what she suspected from it, and what she ultimately knew, and why. At every point where another person might say, "I felt" or "I thought," she would say, "The evidence indicated." That was the method to create a record that could not be challenged. Carver wrote everything down. She asked questions at the perfect moments. Her questions proved to Lena that she was not just creating a timeline. She was using Lena's account to construct a larger picture, one she was assembling from many different sources. At one point, Carver asked, "The shot that hit the car, you said you were about 80 meters out, using a suppressed Mark 12 rifle and shooting through a tinted window. You aimed for the wheel well to disable the car, not to harm the driver. That is a very specific choice." "I did not need him to be dead," Lena answered. "I just needed him occupied for 45 seconds. "And you were confident you could make that shot? From 80 meters, with a weapon I am very familiar with? Yes." Carver wrote something else down. "Your former commanding officer said you had a gift for restraint. He said most snipers will take a clear shot when it is available. He told me you had a talent for knowing when not to shoot." Lena said, "My commander was a very generous man. He said you were the finest he had ever trained. She replied simply, he was still generous. After 90 minutes, Carver shut the folder. She looked at Lena and said something totally unexpected. Thank you. Your actions tonight saved important lives, and you have protected evidence that will uncover problems that have been kept secret for a very long time. I want you to be aware that I understand the personal price you paid for what you did. Lena looked back at her. It did not cost as much as you believe. No, Carver said. I am aware. That is precisely my point. And then she was gone. The team prepared to leave with the silent teamwork of people who have been together for a long time. Ghost left without looking back. Pip gave Lena a short nod, a man who communicated through actions rather than words. Hawk said, Excellent work tonight, ma'am. His voice was sincere and slightly formal. Lena took his words the same way she took Pauline's thanks, because they were both genuine. And you should always face reality head-on. Elias was the only one who remained in the room with her. She knew he was about to speak. She had been expecting it during the entire meeting, like waiting for a storm that you can see coming. You are not afraid of it, you just know it has to be handled, he said. I made a few calls while you were talking. I know, she answered. You know? He asked, surprised. Elias, you have been at this hospital for 9 hours. You have been in the middle of a crisis for most of it. But for the last 90 minutes, you stood against that wall with nothing at all to do. Of course you made some calls. He looked at her with an expression she was starting to learn. It was his way of showing surprise. It was small and contained, but it was definitely there, if you knew what to look for. Gerald's son, she said. The debt is being taken care of, he said. She paused for a second. How? Carver has his methods. Gerald told them everything, and his phone's data confirmed your version of events. It pointed them to a number that then created 2 additional links in the chain. Gerald was helpful tonight, even if he did not want to be. It only seemed fair that his son should not pay for his father's lack of courage, she said. That was a kind thing to do. It was practical, he said, but also kind. The 2 things can be true at the same time. He paused. I am learning that tonight. She picked up her identification badge from the table where she had put it after the meeting. She looked at it for a moment. You said Danny has to get that bag to the correct people, and he will need protection while he does it. That is right. And after that, when this investigation goes where Carver thinks it will go, certain people will have to be located. People who are very good at not being found. He let that idea linger in the room. The kind of work that requires patience, accuracy, and the ability to analyze a situation and a person, and then decide the perfect time to act and the perfect time to wait. She looked straight at him. You are not talking about a security job. No, you are talking about a field operation. I am referring to something that demands all of your abilities, not just your skills as a sniper or a nurse. It is about combining those talents and everything else you know. That skill allows you to both comfort a terrified woman at midnight and fire a silenced shot through a tire from 80 meters with only 4 minutes remaining. He looked directly at her. That mix of skills is very rare, Lena. She turned the badge over in her hands. It was such a small thing. It had a photo, a name, a job title, and a barcode that unlocked certain doors. 11 weeks of her life were summarized in a tiny plastic rectangle. She asked, If I go with you from this hospital tonight, who will do Warren's 6 o'clock heart check? Elias answered, Someone else will take care of it. And Pauline's follow-up appointment, someone else will do it. And the 43 other patients on this floor are cared for by excellent nurses and doctors who do not need me in particular, Elias repeated. Someone else will do it. He waited. The issue is whether someone else can do what you are capable of. She met his stare. Someone else can almost always handle most tasks. The important question is whether they do it with the same level of care. And do they? She gave that an honest thought. Sometimes, she admitted. Sometimes they do it even better. She put the badge back in her pocket. She stood up. I am going to see how Danny is doing. He stepped away from the door to let her by, and she could feel him behind her as she walked down the corridor. She noticed the distance he kept, which was more than he had allowed 12 hours ago when he put a hand on her shoulder and ordered her out of the operating room. The distance between those two moments was not measured in inches or feet. It was measured by everything that had happened since that time. Danny Reyes was awake. She had not expected that. She went into the side room and saw him propped up on two pillows with his eyes open. The monitor beeped with a steady, even rhythm, confirming he was alive. His face showed the look of a man who had missed the worst of it and was now trying to understand what happened from the few clues available. He was younger than she had pictured, maybe in his early 30s. He was built for effectiveness, not for size. He possessed the firm, practical muscles of someone who had to move fast in difficult places and had conditioned his entire body for that job. His face had a certain expression she had seen on other Special Forces operators. It was not exactly toughness, but a kind of calm acceptance. He appeared to be someone who had seen the worst things humans can do to each other, made the choice to keep going anyway, and had found a kind of peace with that decision. He looked at her as she entered. He asked, "Are you the nurse?" "Yes. Elias told me about you." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "He said you were something else." She checked his blood pressure and his intravenous lines without saying a word. He asked, "The bag, Vasik's bag, is it safe?" "It is in good hands now," she said. "Carver has it." He exhaled. That one breath felt heavier than most. It was the sound of a man who had been completely focused on a single objective for a very long time and was just beginning to relax. "I have been carrying that thing for 6 weeks," he explained, "since before they cut me, since before I realized they had made me." She looked at him. "The knife was because they knew you had seen the order. The knife was their method of trying to scare me into vanishing. They did not kill me because a dead Navy SEAL attracts too much notice. An injured one who stays silent is just a training accident." His jaw muscles clenched. They underestimated how much notice I was willing to attract. She finished checking his blood pressure. "You were meant to be killed tonight." The second explosive. "I know." They concluded that the attention was worth the risk in the end. "I know that as well." He paused for a moment. "Because Vasic made his play. Because the bag was being brought here. Once it was in the hands of officials, a living witness was a liability, but a dead one could be dealt with." He looked straight at her. "They made their decision. He is still alive, so that means someone at this hospital made a different one," she replied. "Several of us did." He was quiet for a moment. "I heard about what happened with Vasic in the north hallway," Elias told me. Another pause. "He also told me what you said to him about staying, about being the person who fixes problems." She pulled up his medical chart on the tablet. "Your vital signs look good. You should get some sleep. I have been unconscious for 6 hours." "That is not exactly the same as sleeping, but it is similar." He kept his gaze on her. "I am going to testify. Whatever Carver requires, whenever she requires it. I have been pushing toward this for 6 weeks, and it does not end tonight. I know. But I want you to understand that no matter what you decided tonight, to stay, to leave, to go back, or not, I understand why it is not a simple choice." His voice was quiet and firm, the voice of a man who had faced enough complicated situations to know they rarely have easy answers. "Because I have served in the field, and I have laid in the hospital bed. They are not as different as people think. Both of them require you to remain totally focused on what is happening right in front of you. Both of them require you to care more than is probably smart," she said. "You need to get some rest so your body can recover from Dr. Hartwell's surgery." He nearly smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She finished updating his chart and walked toward the door. Her hand was on the doorframe when he called out, "Lena!" She stopped. "My mother is a nurse," he told her. "She has been one for 30 years, working down in San Antonio." He stopped for a second. "She always said that the most difficult thing to teach is knowing when you should hold on and when you should let go. She said that some nurses can never learn it. She said that the ones who do are worth 10 of anyone else." She stood by the door for a moment. She did not turn around. She said, "Get some rest, Danny." She walked back out into the hall. Elias was standing there. He had been waiting with the quiet stillness of a man who understands how to be patient, a kind of patience that doesn't need to be announced. She told him, "I am going to write up Danny's discharge summary and the aftercare instructions. It will likely take about an hour. I want to be sure that the person who takes over his care has all the necessary information to do it properly." She paused. "When I am done with that, I will go and speak to Diane." Elias asked, "What do you plan to say to her? The truth, or at least as much as I am allowed to tell, that I am taking a leave of absence, and that I will be back." She looked at him with a firm expression. "I will be back. I believe you," he said, and she could tell he meant it, not as a polite remark, but as a statement of fact. He said everything like that, with the certainty of a man who had learned that words without meaning always have a high cost. She walked to the nurse's station, got Danny's chart, opened the discharge summary, and started to write. The ward was calm and quiet around her. The monitors continued their steady, constant work. Farther down the hall, a patient shifted in their sleep, and a nurse made a silent adjustment to their bedding. And outside the hospital, the city did what all cities do at 2 o'clock in the morning, which is simply continue on, completely unaware of what had just taken place inside one specific building. She wrote the summary using precise medical language, including everything Hartwell would need and everything the next doctor would need. The wound's background, the surgical procedures, the medication plan, and the follow-up care were all laid out in perfect order to ensure a seamless transition. She wrote it just like she had handled everything else tonight, with great care and no shortcuts, understanding that the quality of this paper would impact someone's health. That was important now, and it would remain important long after she left. She was in the middle of writing the painkiller instructions when Diane Kowalski approached the nurse's station. Diane observed her for a long while. She looked at the chart that Lena was working on. She looked at Lena's hands and the subtle signs of the night's chaos that were still there, even after 2 washings. She glanced toward the consultation room door, which seemed to hold the memory of federal agents, Navy SEALs, and 3 hours of decisions that no nursing school could ever train you for. She asked, "Do you want to tell me what happened here tonight?" Lena answered, "Most of it. I can tell you most of it." Diane repeated her words. She pulled a chair over and sat across the counter, sitting in a way that showed 19 years of experience had taught her the most important talks often happen at 2 in the morning across a shared table. "Was anyone on my staff in danger tonight because of something that involved you?" Lena looked her right in the eye. "No. The threat was already here because of a patient. My actions made the situation safer. They never caused the danger." Diane considered this. The men in suits who had departed 20 minutes earlier were federal agents. The matter was now being handled at the appropriate level, and the agents in tactical gear from this morning were still present. One is a patient, due for release in about 36 hours with a care plan I am currently writing. Diane remained quiet for a long time. It was the silence of a woman making calculations, not emotional ones, but logistical ones. It was the kind of thinking that had managed a trauma ward for 2 decades, keeping people alive and the entire operation from collapsing. Diane finally asked, "So, are you resigning?" "No," Lena replied. "I am taking leave, but I will return. For how much time? I do not know yet." Diane gave her a look of reappraisal, the same one from the hallway crisis. 11 weeks ago, I saw you as capable but inexperienced. I was wrong," Lena said. You were just going by what you saw. I was only seeing the surface, Diane conceded. After 19 years, I should know better, but I misjudged you. She paused. Why did you not tell me anything? It was not related to the work I was meant to do. Until tonight. It is now, Lena agreed. Diane's eyes scanned the patient's summary on the monitor. She reviewed a few sentences. This is very well done, she commented. Thank you. This aftercare plan is more thorough than Hartwell's usual work. Dr. Hartwell performs surgery. She is not a writer of care plans. No, Diane stated. But you are. She got to her feet, smoothing her scrubs out of habit. Whiteman, I need you back quickly. I am moving you to the day shift. Days are where I need your ability to assess a situation. Lena met her gaze. I will be back. Diane gave one decisive nod, a clear sign the issue was closed. She returned to her office. Lena completed the summary at 3:47 a.m. She printed, signed, and filed the chart for the next physician. She peeked in on Warren, who slept deeply, his hand resting on the covers. She saw Pauline was also sound asleep. Her phone on the table was dark, suggesting her daughter had called and was now at peace. In the locker room, she changed from her scrubs into her regular clothes, slowly reacquainting herself with the familiar fabric. She took her badge off the lanyard, pausing for a moment. She slid it into her jacket pocket, over her heart. It felt familiar, like other objects she had carried in other pockets from a past that was not quite past. Elias stood near the ambulance bay. Ghost, Pip, and Honk were visible through the doors. They moved with the focused calm of professionals preparing for a new phase. She went outside to meet them. The air was crisp, and the city hummed its constant tune. The hospital behind her did the same. She never glanced back. She was not leaving forever, so there was no need. Looking back is for permanent goodbyes. The journey took 4 hours, passing through places she should not recognize. That was not a problem. Names of places had become irrelevant to her long ago. Only the vector, the range, and her companions mattered. She had verified all 3 before leaving the garage. Ghost was at the wheel. Pip was beside him. Hawk sat behind, watching the road behind them. The danger was clearly not over just because they had left the hospital. Elias sat next to her. He was awake. She recognized his specific kind of alertness. It was not from rest, but from sheer determination and training, holding off physical fatigue. She was also awake, but not weary. A night like this one left no space for tiredness. It produced a sharp clarity, a temporary state she knew would not last. Around the 3rd hour, Elias spoke. You need to rest, she answered. So do you. That was the end of the conversation. They drove on in silence. The car moved on. She recalled Pauline's face upon hearing the good news. She saw Warren's hands, calm on the bedspread. She remembered Danny Ria's words about caring too much. It was possibly the truest statement she had heard in years. Their destination was a place she could never talk about. The people who belonged there knew of it. Anyone else had no need to. The facility was safe and had everything they needed. It was operated by people who shared their unique worldview and skills. At the initial checkpoint, the guard noted her hospital badge, her only form of ID. He looked from the badge to Elias. Elias spoke 2 quiet words. The guard nodded them past without any record. Carver was waiting for them. She was on a call, standing by a table cluttered with files, a computer, and 2 cups. One cup was finished, the other half gone. When Lena entered, Carver pointed to a seat. It was a no-nonsense command from someone 4 hours into a major case with no rest. Lena took the chair. Elias stayed on his feet. Carver hung up and got straight to the point. We notified the deputy director of the investigation at 5:47 a.m. Federal agents took him in at 6:12. His legal team made 3 calls to his office within 20 minutes. 2 of those calls were to individuals we also have in custody. She took a breath. The package provided the grounds. Vasek's story will support it. Danny's account locks it in. She turned to Lena. Your sequence of events from the hospital gave us the command structure for the assault. Our case was thin before that. Now it is strong. So it is finished, Lena stated. The takedown is finished, Carver corrected. The complete inquiry could take a year or more. Her gaze fell to the table. He had help. Some people assisted him, some looked away, and some enabled him. Sorting them out will be a major federal effort. From the door, Ghost added, the mercenaries were hired via a firm hidden under 3 front companies. We are working through those layers slowly, Carver told him. But they are neutralized for now. Their payment was tied to the deputy director's freedom, and he can no longer pay them, Lena said. What happens to Vasek? Carver met her eyes. What about him? He came into that hospital injured with a package, aware that his own people might stop him. He is not military. He is not an operative. He is a person who saw a wrong and risked his life to fix it. Lena paused. What is his fate? Carver's expression shifted, showing not softness but comprehension. We have him protected. When this goes public, we will determine how to reward him. She paused. He asked for you. What did he want to know? He wanted to know if the nurse was safe. Lena studied her hands for a second. Tell him that she is. For 2 more hours, the debrief continued. The questions were now highly specific, more like an after-action review than a narrative. They went over her timeline, the positions of all agents, and the logic behind every decision she made. She gave her answers just as she had before, with complete clarity. She never speculated or embellished her conclusions. A stranger entered the room with a recording device. She glanced at Elias, who nodded slightly. This was for the official transcript, so she recounted it all again, precisely. The facts remain the same no matter the audience. That was a lesson from combat that had proven useful in the emergency room. When the man with the recorder was gone, Carver shut a file. There is one more thing. Lena was silent. The deputy director apparently had more than one clandestine associate. Carver turned a laptop toward Lena. This came in 3 weeks before the attack on Danny Reyes. We had to sit on it to protect the source and could not move fast enough. Carver pointed at the display. Look at the last part. Lena moved in to see the screen. The final section was brief. It contained an unfamiliar name, unknown coordinates, and a file number. The personnel file number belonged to her. She reread it, then leaned back slowly. They knew I was here, she whispered. They knew about Corporal Brooks, Carver corrected. They knew an ex-Marine sniper took a job at the hospital 4 weeks after Danny Reyes' team was moved. They were debating if it was random chance or if you were on to them. Last night's events forced their hand. Lena looked up for a second. There was nothing to figure out. She got it instantly. She just needed a moment to absorb the implications. She realized it then. So you were already watching the hospital. Yes, he admitted. This was never about Vasek's call last night. Was it? This was planned all along. The operation was already in motion, Carver confirmed. Vasek's arrival just moved up the schedule. But we planned this for about 2 weeks. They were always going to move on Danny before his release. Carver paused. You were listed in the plan as a variable. From the doorway, Ghost repeated softly. Elias said nothing, just staring at the floor. She could see the war playing out on his face. It was the look of a man carrying a heavy moral weight, the kind that comes when a bad call costs a life. She said his name gently, Elias. He finally looked up. There was no way for you to know. Your mission was Danny. You walked into a crisis with a man bleeding out, and you secured the scene just like your training taught you. You did not know about our plan because you had not seen it. She held his stare. Do not carry a weight that is not yours to bear. He met her gaze for a long moment before speaking. You were in that building for 11 weeks with zero backup. I was in that building doing my job, she answered calmly. The fact that a few people on a chart saw me as a variable does not change a single thing I did for 11 weeks. It just means the situation was more complicated than I knew. That is all." He stayed quiet. She held his gaze, acknowledging his guilt but refusing to let it turn into a regret he did not earn. He finally gave a small nod. "Yeah, all right." Carver watched them both. She had the focused look of an analyst who had just logged a new piece of data about her team. She said, "There is a position open." Lena turned to her. "It is not on paper. Nothing important we do ever is. But the job is very real. It is necessary, and it requires a specific set of skills that I have spent the last 6 hours confirming you have." She turned the laptop back around. "It involves a federal task force, building cases against 3 more people in the deputy director's inner circle. This job needs someone with access to medical facilities, someone who can operate inside them without drawing any attention. It needs the ability to spot and handle threats as they happen. It also requires making difficult decisions under extreme pressure without waiting for orders." She looked up from the screen. "And it needs someone who gets that the people in those hospitals, the patients and the staff, are not just background noise. They are the entire reason we do this." The room was completely still. Lena finally asked, "For how long?" "That is unknown. This type of work does not follow a schedule, and my position at Mercy General would still be there for me. Officially, you would be on an extended medical leave. We will handle all the paperwork. When this is over, you can go back." Carver watched her with sharp eyes. "If you accept, that is the absolute truth." Lena glanced over at Elias. He was watching her with the same intense concentration he had from the moment she tossed him the intravenous kit. He had caught it without looking, but then his eyes snapped to hers, discovering something he clearly had not anticipated. She had been looked at that way her entire career. Men constantly tried to measure her, to reevaluate her, to put her into a category she refused to fit in. She never cared that they looked. She only cared when they failed to see that who she was a choice. It was not an accident of her past. It was a choice she made and fought for every single day. She spoke clearly. "I need 2 things," Carver replied. "Name them." "Vasek gets a real future, not just a life in protective custody. I want everything he is owed guaranteed in writing before I start." "Agreed. And I need 72 hours." Carver asked, "For what?" "To go back to my hospital." Carver's expression shifted. It was not surprise, but a sudden caution. "That is an active investigation. The timeline, however, can handle a 72-hour delay," Lena said. "The 3 people you are after are not going to disappear in 3 days, and I have patients who need to know I have not just abandoned them." She paused for effect. "I promised a woman named Pauline that I would be there for her follow-up. I told a man named Warren I would check his heart levels at 6 this morning. I wrote a discharge plan for Danny Reyes that I need to personally hand to his next doctor so she understands the full extent of his injuries. These are not minor details to them." She looked straight at Carver. 72 hours. Carver glanced at Elias. Elias was looking at Lena. He said, "She is asking for 3 days to finish her shift." Carver replied, "I understand what she is asking." "Then you should say yes," he said. "Because she is right about the timeline, she is right about her patients, and she is right that it matters. And if you say no," he continued, "you will start this new partnership by proving that the one thing she values most means nothing to you." The room was quiet. Carver looked at Lena and finally said, 72 hours. Lena simply answered, "Thank you." She slept for 4 hours in a small room that smelled like every government office she had ever known. It was a smell she used to hate but now found strangely familiar. She woke up feeling deeply rested, the kind of rest your body gets when it is exactly what it needs. In the kitchen, Ghost was already awake, drinking coffee and reading a file. He looked up when she came in and said, "She sleeps," in a flat tone, as if he were making an official report. She replied, So do you, apparently. And he almost cracked a smile. Elias drove her back to the hospital. She was surprised it was just the two of them. She had expected the whole team, like the ride out. But it was only Elias, the empty highway, and the pale morning light. He drove with the same calm, efficient skill he applied to everything else, with no wasted motion. About an hour into the quiet drive, he asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Your discharge from the service. Camp Pendleton. In November. You said you chose to do something else instead." He kept his eyes on the road. "Why did you choose to work in a hospital?" She thought about how to give him a truly honest answer. She had given Carver and the others the official version last night, but she had not told them the entire story. "Not the real reason," she said. "There was a man in my unit named Corporal Trevino. He took a round to the hip on my last tour. I was the one who treated him on the ground before the medic could get there. I just kept him talking, kept him awake, and when the medic finally made it, he pulled through." She paused. "He told me later that the thing that kept him going was not the pressure I was putting on the wound. It was that I did not sound scared. He said I talked to him as if we had all the time in the world." She stared out the passenger window. "I had spent 4 years shooting at targets from 500 meters away. But the one memory that stayed with me was keeping one man alive by talking to him like time did not matter." She took a deep breath. "I wanted to do more of the second thing," she finished, "and a lot less of the first." Elias was quiet for a long time as the road stretched out ahead of them. At last, he said, "Trevino, is he still serving?" "No, he got out the year after me. He is a paramedic down in Phoenix now." "Good," Elias said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." Another silence fell between them, but this one was comfortable. Then he spoke again. "I need to be straight with you about something." "All right." When Carver described the job this morning, she made it sound simpler than it is. "Of the 3 targets, one of them operates internationally. Some of this work will take you overseas. It might take you to places that feel a lot more like the first kind of work than the second." She met his eyes. "You are warning me. I am being precise," he corrected her, with a slight pause. "I was not precise with you back in the operating room. I judged you on sight and made a bad call. It nearly cost Danny his life. I will not make that same mistake twice." He turned his attention back to the road. "So, yes, I am being precise. This work will not always be the second kind." She replied, "I know, and I am still going back to that hospital for 72 hours. After that, I will deal with whatever comes next." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "I have never been afraid of the first kind of work, Elias. I just got tired of it being my only option." She paused. "If I have a chance to do both, then I will do both." He drove on in silence for a few more minutes. Finally, he spoke. For what it is worth, when Carver went over the operations timeline, she confirmed something that she never actually said. "I know what she left out. Do you?" "The personnel file they intercepted," he said. "The reason they classified me as a variable, and not a target, was because somebody intervened. Someone saw that memo and flagged my file before the deputy director's team had a chance to act." She turned to look at him. "That is why you had people near the hospital, even if you did not know it. The SEAL team showing up yesterday was not a coincidence. And sending Danny to Mercy General, specifically, was not a coincidence either." Elias stayed quiet. Carver stayed silent to protect her source. "But that source is the very reason I am alive and in this car." She gazed at the road that stretched ahead of them. "When you find out who it was, I have to know," he replied. "If I learn their identity, you will be the first person I tell." She nodded, accepting his answer. She looked out her window, thinking about a world where a total stranger could see her name on a paper and decide she would not be sacrificed for someone else's plan. The idea was almost too large to fully grasp. She held the thought for a moment, then released it. There was work to be done, and she would need all her concentration for what was next. The hospital appeared at 10:30 in the morning. She had seen it from this exact angle countless times before, arriving for early shifts, just a normal building holding 1,000 complicated human stories at any moment. The sight of it had always stirred something inside her. She felt it again now. It was a new feeling, yet it was connected to the old one, in the way all genuine things are linked. Elias guided the car into the ambulance bay. He put the car in park and she reached for the door. Then he said her name. She stopped. He said, "What they put in that file, variable. I need you to know that word would never be used by anyone who has worked with you for more than 20 minutes. She turned to face him. He went on, "You are not a variable. You are the most important constant I have encountered in a very long time. And that is not something I say lightly." She simply looked at him for a moment. She thought of all the things she might say and realized none of them were necessary. Instead, she said, "I will see you in 72 hours. Then she exited the car. Marcus was at the front desk when she entered. He glanced up, and she watched his face shift through the same quick expressions she had seen on everyone since the night before. This time, though, his face settled on a look far warmer than the others. He said, "Warren has been asking about you." "I am aware," she answered. "I am heading up now." She took the stairs. She went to Warren's room first, because she had made a promise that she would. And because Warren had trusted them last night, when Elias had sworn to do everything he could, and she had sworn the same. That kind of trust deserved to be honored. Warren was sitting up against his pillows, working on a crossword puzzle. He had the calm look of a man who had chosen to meet the day on his own terms. When she came in, he looked up and said, "Well, look who it is." She asked him, "How are you feeling?" He answered, "Like a man who has been in a hospital bed for 4 days, which means I am more than ready to go home." He put his puzzle aside. "You came back. I told you I would." "Yes, you certainly did." He observed her carefully for a moment. "You appear different. I am the same person." "No," he said softly. "You are the same woman, but it is a different morning." He saw her with the deep wisdom of someone who has lived a long life, able to see the journey in a person's eyes. "Did you get the answers you were looking for?" She checked his chart first, then met his gaze. "I believe I did." "Good," Warren said, nodding. "That is what difficult nights are for." He retrieved his crossword. "I am looking for a 6-letter word for enduring through hardship." She paused to think. "Sturdy." He counted the boxes. "That one will not fit. Heroic," she suggested. He counted again. "That is not it either." She stood beside his bed, reflecting on the challenging night she had just faced. She thought about the next 72 hours, the tasks ahead, and this hospital filled with patients. She thought about the unique and difficult profession she had chosen for herself, and then she said, "Valiant." Warren filled in the word. He studied the puzzle. Then he looked up at her with a slow, warm smile, like someone who finally discovers the right word after a long search. "That is the one," he said. She smiled in return. She placed his chart down and went to find Pauline. After that, she needed to deliver Danny's discharge papers. And then she walked to the nursing station, took the next chart from the pile, and returned to her duties, because that is what she did, and that is who she was. No one in that building, or anywhere else, had ever managed to alter that. Not the Marine Corps, not a tour overseas, not a blade meant to deliver a message, not a federal inquiry. Not some man in a government office who saw her name and viewed her as just a variable. Lena Brooks was not a variable. She was a nurse and a Marine. She was a woman who understood that the gap between saving a life one way and saving a life another was only as wide as you chose to make it, and she had chosen long ago to make it very narrow indeed.